In this video, we're going to finally get our API started. What I mean by the API is we're going to build up an API on our website that will allow our continuous integration server to publish clients and launchers. However, this is going to be something that we'll want to make sure is secured. So what we're going to do for authentication from the continuous integration server is create a system that will allow us to create deployment tokens, is I think what I'm going to call them. These tokens are just going to be randomly generated bits of data that will allow our continuous integration server to authenticate with our website. The idea will be is that we'll create tokens that are locked down to specific IP addresses on the website, and then put those tokens into our continuous integration system so that it can publish clients and launchers that will then be downloaded by our users. So this is going to require that we create a new entity as well as a basic admin interface. I'm going to try to keep this as short as possible, so I'm not going to implement editing tokens. I'm just going to be implementing creating tokens, viewing our existing tokens, and then deleting tokens. And again, every token is going to be bound by a specific IP address that token is valid for, which will further enable some sense of security. In addition, when we eventually get our website pushed to IIS, we are going to be enforcing SSL on every single page, and we'll go about that in a later video. But for now, we'll go ahead and start by creating an entity. So that's going to require us to go into buzzmmo.data entities, into this namespace, and I'm going to create a new entity called deploy tokens, or deploy token. And the deploy token is just going to be, like I said, it's going to have an ID, a token, maybe we'll have a created at date time, and then we'll also have a IP address on it. So I'm going to say public int ID for our identifier column. And then I'm going to have public string IP address. And then we're going to have a public date time created at. And I'm also going to put in a public string token itself. Now the deploy tokens I'm going to want to be 64 bytes long, so they are going to be a bit long, but that's all right. And that means that the length of the string, because this is going to be base 64 encoded, is going to be the amount of bytes that we want multiplied by 4 and divided by 3. So if we have 64 bytes of base encoded information and we multiply that by 4 and divide it by 3, that means we need a width of at least 85 or 86 characters for our well, actually, it's going to be the next multiple of 4, and the next multiple of 4 is 86 a multiple of 4? Yeah, come on. 86 divided by 4, no, so it's going to be 88, which is definitely a multiple of 4. So we're going to need a column width of 88, which the closest power of 2 of 88 is 128, which I'm going to use because I like powers of 2 when I'm doing the width of columns. So I'll do 128 so that we can represent 64 bytes of base 64 encoded data. I'm also going to set this to be a required. For the IP address, I'm going to set this to be required, and I'm going to give it a max length of 64. The reason I'm going to give it a max length of 64 is because the maximum textual representation of an IPv6 IP address is going to be 39 characters. So the next power of 2 for 39 would be 64. So that'll allow this column to fit our both our IPv4 addresses, the ones that we're used to, as well as IPv6 IP addresses as well. Finally, the created at field is also going to be required. All right, so I think this is about it for now with our deploy token entity. However, I do kind of want to go ahead and add in a couple methods. Specifically, I want to add in a constructor. Now, we haven't talked about using constructors with Entity Framework yet, but basically it goes like this. You can add as many constructors as you want to your entities, as long as you have a protected or public constructor that doesn't take any parameters. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to write a protected deploy token constructor, and I'm going to annotate it with a comment saying ef6 ctor. This is just because right now it looks like a rather useless constructor. I want to annotate it with that documentation to specify to people who might be reading this class later, don't delete this constructor because it is required by Entity Framework 6. But what do we want to do on our constructor? Well, our constructor, the one that we'll be using to create deploy tokens, is going to take in an IP address. Then it's going to set its IP address to IP address. It's going to set its created at to date time UTC now. And then we're going to generate our random token. So just like what we did before, I'm going to say using var random equals new RNG crypto service provider, which of course this will bring in our using system security cryptography namespace. Then I'm going to say var buffer equals new byte of, we said we wanted 64 bytes, I think we did. 64 bytes. Then I'm going to say random dot get non-zero bytes buffer, and then I'm going to say token equals convert to base 64 string buffer. So now we can use the second constructor kind of like as a factory method to instantiate a new deploy token and set up its token to a proper value. And then of course we have our Entity Framework 6 required constructor, which is this protected guy right here. Okay, so now that we've added our entity, we have to add it to our context. So I'm going to go to our MMO database context and say public db set deploy token deploy tokens. So our db set deploy tokens, this will inform Entity Framework that we have a new entity. Because we've now done this, we can generate a migration, which will be scaffolded for us, and it'll add the appropriate table to our database called deploy tokens. So let's open our PMC and say add migration, create deploy tokens. Then I'm going to hit enter and wait a year and a half. Oh, that was quick. And we now have our migration created for our create deploy tokens. Our token, I do want to make unique. So to do that, we can, give me a second while I look at this. Fixed length, Unicode, default value, name, annotations. Oh, we might have to change the nvarchar. Did we have to do that before? No, we didn't. The nvarchar properly gets converted into varchars. So that's what we want. We're going to have to add a new statement after we do our primary key, and I'm going to say index. The index is going to specify our, so expression func anonymous type object. It's going to specify our token as the column that we want to add the index to. And we're going to specify unique to be true, because we want this to be a unique index on our database. So not only will this make our queries for our tokens significantly faster, but it will also enforce that our deploy tokens are unique. So now that I've modified the migration in the way I want to, I'll open up my package manager console and type in update database, hit enter. So again, I don't know if I went through this or why we're doing this as much as I should have. What we're going to do as an admin is we're going to create a new random deploy token in the admin, and then we're going to paste it into our CI server. And then when our CI server deploys a new launcher or client, it'll take that token and use it as part of the request to validate the authenticity of setting up that that database, or sorry, that upload for the launcher or for the client. Okay, so we now have our deploy tokens database or table created. I'm going to close out of all the files we have open because we won't need these guys anymore. And then I'm going to scope to my BuzzMMO web project. I'm going to go open up our admin area, and I'm going to create a new controller called deploy tokens controller. I'm going to make sure that I add a authorize attribute to it with roles equaling admin to ensure that nobody but admins can get to this controller. To make it a controller, I of course have to inherit from controller. Okay, so there's a variety of actions that we're going to need to implement on our controller. Let's go through creating or stubbing out all of our actions first. The first thing we want is an index, which is going to return a view of deploy tokens index. Whoops, I want that new keyword in there, which is a view model that we haven't created yet. Then we're going to have a create method. The create method will return a new deploy tokens index, which again we haven't, deploy tokens create for our form. We'll have another create method that takes in a deploy tokens create form method, which will simply return view form, and this will be annotated with HTTP post. Then we'll have a delete int ID action, which will be an HTTP post. For now, this action will simply return redirect to action index, which hopefully I'll spell index correctly. And that will actually be the stub of our deploy token controller. We need a way to view all of our tokens. We need a way to create a new token. And we need a way to delete an old token that we don't want anymore. So let's go ahead and create our view models. Our deploy tokens index and our deploy tokens creator are the only two view models we need to make. So let's go ahead and go open up our view models namespace and add a deploy tokens index class. This will be a public IEnumerable of deploy token called tokens. We're not going to worry about creating a view model representation of our deploy tokens. We'll just send our entity straight into our view, which will be fine because since they don't have any navigation properties on them, there would be no way for the view to accidentally start executing SQL. If our deploy token class ever starts to become more complex, then we might want to create a custom view model representation of that class as opposed to sending the entity directly in. But that's a decision that we can make later. So our deploy token index view model simply has a list of deploy tokens that's going to send to the view. Then we need our deploy tokens create view model, which will have a public string IP address, which will be required. So that's literally all we need in our deploy tokens create view model is our IP address, which is required, because that's the only parameter that we're going to be passing into our deploy tokens create method. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to finish up the controller before we do the views. Because this is such a simple system, we can go ahead and just finish all of its logic before we write the actual front-end code that shows us our tokens. So first of all, I'm going to import the BuzzMMO Web Areas Admin View Models namespace. Then at the top of this class, I'm going to say private read-only MMO database context database equals new MMO database context, so that we are looking at now at our database, or now have access to our database. Our index action is simply going to return tokens equals database.deploy tokens dot order by, how about order by descending, created at .toList. So this will execute a SQL statement that will return all of our deploy tokens in descending order of when they were created, so newest or newer tokens will appear near the top. Our get action for our create method will not fill anything into our deploy tokens create view model because it has no data that we need to send into it. We'll leave this code in here. We could in theory pass in null if we wanted to, or nothing. But I like stubbing out instantiating our view models even if we don't fill it with anything, because in the future, if we want to fill it with anything, we can trivially add that logic later. Next up, our create method. This is our post action, so this method will be invoked when we post to it. I'm simply going to say if not model state dot is valid, return view form. If our model state is valid, I'll say var token equals new deploy token, which of course will bring in the buzzmmo.data.entities namespace, and then I'll pass in form.ip address. This will create the token and generate its random tokenness, but it won't add it to the database. To do that, we do database.tokens.add token, and then database save changes, and then finally return redirect to action index. Our delete method will be pretty straightforward as well. All we got to do is say var token equals database tokens load, or is it get, or is it find? It's find. Find ID. If token is null, how about just return HTTP not found? That'll return a 404 back to the browser. If it is found, then say database.deployTokens.remove token database.savechanges. And this is it. I mean, for such a simple model, all we have to do is make a means of listing our deploy tokens, creating them, and deleting them. We're not going to be worrying about editing or anything else. So as a result, our controller clocks in at a nice 53 lines of code, and this will pretty much wrap up our controller in its entirety. What we got to do now, though, is we have to create our views. There are two views we want to create, our list view and our create view. So let's open up our Solution Explorer and expand our views folder and add a new folder inside of our views folder that corresponds to our controller name, which is deploy tokens. Inside of this, we'll start off by creating our index view, which will create a index.cshtml file. Our model is going to be deploy tokens index, which of course will autocomplete to include the namespace. Then everything else I will delete. I want to go ahead and take a look, just to be consistent, at my users index to make sure. So we start with an H1, we have a paragraph with the create link, and then we have a table. I'm going to set this off to the side here so we can view both of them at the same time, so I can keep our admin rather consistent, because I really like having consistent admin panels. We'll start off with writing in an H1 for deploy tokens. Then we'll open up a paragraph and we'll do HTML action link create token, or how about, yeah, just create token. That goes to the create action. We'll pass in an empty route parameters, and then we'll pass in a class of button, button small, button primary? No, button default. We use the button default class for our add button. So then we want a table. So we'll say table class equals table striped. Then we want our t head. Inside of our t head, we'll have one row, and that will have token IP address actions. Then in our t body, we'll have a for each var token in model.tokens. We'll open up a table row. We'll add in a td for token.token. We'll add in a td for token.ip address. And then we'll add in our actions. Our actions are going to be a div class of button group. And we'll only have one action. Since we don't have any delete action, we'll start off with, since it said blah, 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 blah. Since we don't have any edit action, we're really just concerned about putting in our delete button. So I'm just going to look over here. Okay, so we're going to open up a hyperlink. We're going to say url.action for the href. We're going to pass in delete with a new route parameter of token.id. The class of this button is going to be the same over here. Actually, I'm going to move this down to the bottom of the screen so we get more vertical space. There, that's nice. The class of our button is going to be button, button extra small, button danger, and post. The data message is going to be, are you sure you want to delete this token? Inside of the A tag, we're going to write an I tag with a class of glyph icon. glyph icon, glyph icon dash remove, and it'll have the text of delete. Okay, so I can go ahead and close out my index.cshtml for my users, and we can take a look at the full token list. Pretty straightforward. We have a create token button, and we have a table that shows all of our tokens. The next and final view that we need to write is going to be our create view. So I'm going to go down here, and I'm going to create a new Razor HTML view, and I'm going to call it create. So remember, I'm adding this CSHTML file to our deploy tokens folder. The model is going to be called deploy tokens create, which is going to autocomplete to include the namespace. The rest of the code is going to be deleted. Then, just like what we did before, to make sure things are consistent, I'll open up my create user view, and I'll base my markup off of that. So I'm going to put in an H1 called create deploy token. I'm going to say using HTML begin form, HTML.validation summary, div class equals form group, HTML label for username, or sorry, what am I doing? IP address, HTML.text box for IP address with a new class of form control. That's going to be the only field that we'll have, so we'll put in a paragraph. We'll put in our input of type submit, value of create token, class of button, button default, button small, and then we'll say or HTML action link go back with an action of index. Okay, so that pretty much wraps everything up for our deploy tokens. Let's go ahead and test it. I'm going to hit F6 to do a new compilation of our website. And then I'm going to come over here to our site and refresh and wait a million years for IIS to Express to refresh. I'm going to log in as admin. I think my password was test. Indeed it was. I'm going to hit the admin button. Oh, we did forget to put the deploy tokens up there at the top. So I'm going to go ahead and do that real fast. Let's go to our shared underscore layout.cshtml file. So double click that. And then up here at the top, I'll add a new li HTML action link deploy tokens. Index deploy tokens. So just adding a nice little convenient button at the top of our layout of our admin so that I can easily navigate to that page. So now I can click on deploy tokens and I see there are no tokens. Let's create one. Let's give it an IP address of 127.0.0.1 and create the token, and we have a token. Now the token is a little bit irritating in its length. Let's create another one. 127.0.0.1. And then let's make sure we can delete it. So I'm going to hit delete. It says, are you sure you want to delete this token? Yes, and the token does disappear. So I'm able to create and delete tokens. Now let's create a couple. I do want to make it easier to select these. Typically, one of the easiest ways to allow a selection of a really long bit of text is to throw it in a read-only text input. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's move this off to this side. I'm not sure how this is going to look immediately because I wasn't planning on doing this, but hopefully it'll turn out all right. So in our TD, instead of printing out our token.token, I'm going to say input type equals text, read only equals read only, value equals token.token. Then I'm going to delete that token.token before. Come back here and refresh, and we see we now have these nice little text boxes. Let's go ahead and see what happens if we give it a form control class. Here we go. That looks good. So now it's a lot easier to select the entire token, and it looks a whole lot cleaner. So now I can just double click on any of these text boxes, and I get access to, or it selects the entire token for me. All right. Well, I think that just about wraps up our deploy tokens. So now we have a way of creating tokens that we can use to authenticate with the API. So in the next video, we'll actually go ahead and get our API methods, or a couple of those methods, stubbed out and talk a little bit about Web API. And then we're going to create a custom action filter to validate that the token was correctly sent to the server given a particular request. So we'll see you guys next video.